Hey everybody, Mr. Battellini here, and this is going to be sort of a special edition of the daily lesson because you have an assessment coming up. The Cold War unit is almost over, and before we get to that assessment, we should review the strategies for analyzing political cartoons and the strategies for finding locations on a map. Let's get things started off with the bell ringer. Number one, what was the domino theory? Number two, why did the United States help South Vietnam in the Vietnam War? And number three, how did the American people feel about our involvement in the Vietnam War? And let's take a look at the answers. The domino theory was this theory that if one country falls to communism, the countries next to that country will fall as well. And then pretty soon, all the countries in a nice little row were going to fall to communism and try to accept communism until eventually that communist domino chain reaches the United States. Remember, that's why we want containment, so that the domino theory, one by one, countries falling to communism, doesn't actually happen. Number two, why did the United States help South Vietnam in the Vietnam War? Well, South Vietnam was the non-communist half of the country. Remember, just like Korea, the North was communist, being helped by the Soviet Union and by China. The South was the non-communist half. And since we didn't want it to expand because of the domino theory, we helped out South Vietnam in the Vietnam War. Remember that war ended not in such a great way for us. North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, and peace returned to the country, but the whole country became a communist country. So this did not end in the way that the Korean War ended, but we did help South Vietnam because they were non-communist. How did the American people feel about our involvement in Vietnam War? They did not agree at all. Very divided opinions, huge amount of anti-war protests that we shouldn't really be in Vietnam. There's a whole genre of music in the 70s and 60s called protest songs, and there's all sorts of folk music about stopping the war and getting out of Vietnam. But remember, Kent State was the most violent example of that, where students were actually killed to suppress a protest. So, this is the first cartoon in your packet that we ask you to analyze. That there are basically two types of students here. One type of student is going to look at that and know exactly immediately what everything means, and they're going to be able to answer the questions. They're going to look at this and say, oh, well, the bear represents this country, and the eagle is obviously us, and here's what that gap represents, and so here's the entire message of the cartoon. Boom. If you have trouble with that type of symbolism, there's a process that you should follow. And the process starts like this. Number one, literally just write down what's going on in the picture. Don't worry about what everything means and the symbols and what the symbols symbolize. Just literally write down what you see in the picture. And I'm going to do that right here. I'm literally going to write down a bear is looking angrily at an eagle with a big gap in between them. I'm not saying anything about what the eagle means or what the bear means or the symbols on their backs or even the writing in the cartoon. First step, literally just write what you can physically see. Step two is where you get into the symbols. Now, you should definitely by now, in the Cold War, know what country a bear symbolizes. You should definitely know at this point in American history what country an eagle symbolizes. So those shouldn't be difficult. You should also probably know what the hammer and sickle symbolize. You should probably know what the stars on a blue background symbolize. So that shouldn't be difficult either. The two animals you should know immediately. At this point in the Cold War, you should know which two countries those stand for. You can read the different labels inside of this gulch. Remember here they're calling it a gulch. A gulch is just a huge big gap. And so you don't need to guess what the gulch symbolizes because it tells you. Irresponsible statements, deepening suspicions. It's just a separation, a deepening separation, and a distrust between those two countries. So what you're going to do for step 2 is you're going to use those symbols to translate the sentence. Pick out the words that you can change because you know what they symbolize. For example, we can pick out the word bear. We can pick out the word eagle. We can pick out the word big gap because we know that these are things that are symbols that we can translate now. The bear, what does it symbolize? Well, we know that the bear is the Soviet Union or communism. So I'm going to change that in the sentence. It's not a bear is looking, it's the Soviet Union is looking. And they're looking angrily at not an eagle, because we know what the eagle symbolizes. We're looking at the United States. And we know from the label that that big gap or that gulch symbolizes a divide or a distrust in between them. So now read your sentence back. A Soviet Union or communism, you can change it to the Soviet Union or communism, is looking angrily at the United States with a divide or a distrust in between them. Now, suddenly, that new sentence is explaining exactly what the artist wants you to see in this picture. And that's basically the main idea. And you can see what the artist thinks about that. The artist thinks that it's time to bridge that gap. It's time to create a bridge between these two things. It's time to remove that divide or distrust. These are the other two cartoons in the packet. And again, some of you are going to look at this and say, oh, Congress rushing to help Western Europe to save it from communism. I know what law this is. I know what policy this is. Some of you are going to need to use the 3-step process, and that's okay. Some of you are going to say, oh, I get what those two things are, and I get what they're trying to do here. I get which U.S. foreign policy is trying to push the Soviet Union's communism back into itself and not help it spread. I know exactly what that is. Some of you are going to need to use the 3-step process. That's okay. If you need to use it, you need to use it. But let's take a look at the map now, because there's a couple of geographic skills that you're going to need to know. This is the exact map you're going to see on the test, and it's going to ask you, first of all, where the Iron Curtain was. And you probably won't need to actually label it, but if you do need to label it, because you need to find it to figure out which side was which side, there's a little trick here. Instead of just randomly picking out countries because you think you know where they are, find one thing first to ground you. Find one thing on this map that's going to ground you in relation to everything else. You could say, well, I know the Soviet Union is the big one out here. You could say, well, the island one, number 8, I know that's England because that's the only island one, the only full country that's an island in Europe that we've talked about so far. For me, it's going to be Denmark. So you can see this whole landmass of Europe. When you find the little thing that pokes up out of mainland Europe, that little thing right there, that is Denmark. If you go right down from Denmark, you see the split in Germany. That's how you find the two countries that should be Germany. You find West Germany and East Germany. So you're looking at the map, you know that Russia's the big one in the east. You find the little thing that's sticking up out of Europe, and that's Denmark. If you go directly down, that's the beginning of the Iron Curtain. That is the divide right there between West Germany and East Germany. The real Iron Curtain wraps around here with Czechoslovakia and goes down here. That red line right there is the Iron Curtain. But really for the test, what you need to know is how to find the two countries that are supposed to be one Germany. And again, you find Denmark, you go straight down. There they are at numbers 3 and 5. So now that we know where that Iron Curtain actually is, you will be asked now, which country had a bunch of satellite states? And remember, satellite state is the term that we use for those countries that the Soviet Union took over and formed like a little shield in Eastern Europe. So here's the Soviet Union, and here are all their satellite states. The satellite states are going to be on that Soviet Union side of the Iron Curtain. Same thing if it asks you who's behind the Iron Curtain. Behind the Iron Curtain means you're on the Soviet Union side of that line. And that's all we have for you today. Your key takeaways. Cartoonists will use animals to symbolize countries and national symbols to symbolize countries. They'll use facial expressions to symbolize attitudes and feelings. And of course, the words will label the different symbols in the picture. And remember that phrase, satellite states, that are considered behind the Iron Curtain. Those are the Soviet satellite states that are on the Russian side of the Iron Curtain. And your daily directions today are to use that process to complete numbers 32 and 33. Please check Schoology to see if there's any discussions and respond if there are. That's all we've got. Stay safe, stay productive, and we will see you next time.